Good morning, everyone. This is Janaína Pantoja here, Director of Education with UXPA International. We are very excited to bring this webinar to you today. Carrie Hain is here today, and she will be sharing her perspective on using content as design material. Before she starts, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, use the GoToWebinar control panel. So you see like a little panel that says questions. So look for that tab, enter your questions throughout the webinar, and Carrie will get to those questions towards the end of the webinar. We will be recording the webinar, and we will share the recording on the UXPA International YouTube account. I'm going to send an email to everyone with the recording link. And if you have any suggestions for future webinars, please contact me at education@uxpa.org. We have some exciting short courses coming up. We just ended one on UX psychology. So please check out our website, uxpa.org, if you want to learn more about future webinars and short courses. So Carrie, thanks so much for leading this webinar today. We are so excited about it. And when you're ready, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and get started.
All right, thanks, Jenna. Hi, everyone. I'm assuming everyone's from around the world, so it's not morning. It's certainly not morning here on the East Coast of the US. We're now afternoon. But I'm excited to be here to talk to you today. I, just by way of introduction, if you don't know me, I'm Carrie. I am a content strategist based outside of Washington, DC, and I've been doing some form of content strategy for nearly 20 years now. So I was one of the lucky ones to get started at the beginning and work my way through and figure this out as we grew. And yeah, a lot of what I'm talking about today is just a result of all the things that I've learned from other people and put them to work for my organizations and clients over the last 20 years. So I hope that it is really fruitful for you as well. So you can cut through some of the things I had to take years to learn. So as I try to control things, we're user experience professionals, and we're all familiar with user journeys. We spend a lot of time talking about them, creating them, getting others to care about them. But here's the thing. We spend a lot of time designing and optimizing just a few of them. But guess what? Users' journeys might most often start on the X, but they don't always go directly to Y and then Z. They have a mind of their own, and they have something to do. They want to choose their own adventure. Therefore, we must design not just for 40 possible endings, as By Balloon to the Sahara does. We must design for any journey and make the user the hero of the story. So, is that possible? You might be asking yourself. And I'm here to say yes. Yes, it is. And that possibility starts with a content first mentality. So, as I was preparing for this webinar, I wanted to do a little user research, so I asked Twitter, what questions do you have when you hear content? What is content as a design material? And one person, Dan from the UK, said that its primary function is to act as a vehicle for delivering content. And of course, that starts with the users, their needs, and a lot of other things that lead to designing the content. And a lot of people will say, but it's a chicken and an egg kind of situation. How can I do content till I know what it's going to look like? And how do I design the content? And how do I know what it's going to look like till I know what the content is? The thing is, it's not a chicken and the egg thing. It really isn't. Content can come first. So here were some other questions I got. Matt asked, are content and design separate things? Is content, a known quantity that can be set, then manipulated. And then Anne asked, how do we get visual designers and content owners to play? Well, I'm glad you asked that, Anne. But before I get to the answer, no, we're not going to commercial, but we're going to do a little poll. If I can get things figured out and technology cooperates. So I'm going to put a poll up here. You should see that on your screen. So just check which one. How where does content happen in your projects? Does it happen before the design? Does it happen after the UI design is set? So you're filling in all the boxes, or does it happen when everything else is done? It's the last thing that you do. So I'll give you just a little bit more time to check. We've got quite a bit of response. So I'll give you another 10 seconds about to respond and see where most people are. All right. All right, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So this is interesting. So I think you can see this, I hope. So 43% of you do content before the UI design. Yay! And then another 42% do it after the UI design is set. Not so happy about that, but not surprised. And 15, I think that's a 15, I don't have my glasses on, when everything else is done, you do it last. Well, congratulations, you're better off than most of the audiences that I talk to. Hardly anyone does it first, and more people do it last. So I feel good, and obviously you've self-selected to attend this webinar because you think that it's important to do content first. So I'm going to hide results, and I think that should end it. But let's think about those results of not even half of you are doing content first, and another almost half are doing it after the design. For those of you doing it after the design and at the end of a project, is that working? Would you like to do it different? Then if you want to do things differently, you need to find out who on your team is responsible for the content. And if you look around,
Hey,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but after the poll, like the screen became black, so I'm not sure if.
Oh,
okay, it's back now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Let me just go back there. Okay. So, oh, I don't know why that's black. Anyway, by virtue of selecting this webinar, you're interested in that. So maybe it's you who's responsible for content because no one else is. And if you want someone else to be, you either need to get them on board and assign it to them, make them accountable for it, get them to watch this webinar, do some education to understand how to do content first. It's simple, not easy, I'll admit, but it's the truth. Someone has to be responsible for content if it's going to come first. So back to the question of how to get visual designers and content owners to play together. The answer is to create content first. If you're the one creating the interface, do not put a pixel on the screen until you have actual content. If you're the content person, insist on providing content before a pixel is committed. And if you're the project manager or someone else and you don't see real content, make it happen. Find a way. And to answer the question of how do we design for any journey and make the user the hero of the story, the answer to that really is putting resource before representation. And there goes Keynote. Sorry, folks. Someday technology will cooperate and I'll be able to do a whole presentation without it crashing. All right. So we do content first by putting resource before representation, by creating content resources not as a series of web pages, but by chunking content into its smallest atoms so that it can be used over and over, and putting that together in a way that makes sense for everyone and in any way that a user wants, as long as it's what you have to offer. Of course, you can't do everything for everyone, because users are on endless journeys, and there's countless journeys that they want to take. And content is no longer single use. It has to go everywhere. And for content to be free, to travel through space and time, it must be structured. And that means the ways we've been doing things have to go the way of the dinosaurs. It no longer works, if it ever did. So maybe this process looks familiar to you. You do user experience, however that happens. There's research, there's planning, things like that, personas, discovery, all of the stuff that a UX researcher or designer does. Someone might do a content audit, make a sitemap, do some wireframes at that point, and then it gets turned into a Photoshop file or InVision or whatever people are using these days, and that gets handed over to the front-end developers to code, and the CMS developers will get the wireframes and sitemap to implement, and the developers will finish and declare things ready for content. And then you wait and wait. So that doesn't work, right? This looks a little bit better, right? Content strategy at the beginning. We're going to start with content. Then we're going to hand it off to the UX person, do wireframes with real content, and then, do the interface design, hand it over to developers. And yeah, that doesn't really work either. And neither of those work for one simple reason. They're linear. They do not make room for changes during the process, and they do not look forward to the next step. And really, Agile isn't better, it's just different. Because the thing is, content strategy isn't a thing you do, it's a practice. It's a thing that happens to happen throughout a project, throughout an organization. Content creation takes time, and there needs to be a pause, a check-in to make sure the content is lined up with the design and development. So we need a process that allows content, UX and UI design, and programming to work from the same set of instructions, sort of like an orchestra where each instrument has its part, its own sheet music, but when they play it together all at the same time, we have a beautiful sound. So I propose this process where we start with a model, a content model. Everyone's involved. You can actively engage stakeholders, do some activities, and get conversations going with developers very early on, so that when it's time to build, it's all in parallel. And then you come out the other side with no wrong styles, that the content and the design and the CMS have been planned, co-planned really together, so everyone knows what everyone else is doing. They're not making guesses. Accessibility is easier. Relationships are created with input from people, and everyone can confidently do their work knowing exactly what they're supposed to be doing or who to ask if a question comes up. So we're going to focus on designing with content today, and it's a three-step process essentially to make sure that content is the material of design rather than the stuff that fills up the boxes on a screen. And so we start with a model. No, two models actually. A domain model, which extends your user research to understand not just how a user might interact with your product, but what interests they have in a subject area in which your product operates. And then you have a content model, not CMS specifications, but a representation of the content types and their attributes for your organization, not just a single product. It's something that spans every product that you have. So models give you a set of content types, the resources, which you will then create as representations, as windows into that world of that model that's humming along underneath. And essentially the resources are surrogates for the things themselves. The models model truth, not digital products. And so just as we talk about the map is not the territory it represents, it's still really useful. Likewise, models are how we put resource before representation. Before we can represent a concert on a website or through an Alexa skill or on an app or in a Google Knowledge Graph, we need to define its parts and relationships with other content. So here's a domain model for live music, because the domain is the subject area. It's not a company. It could be used by many companies, in fact. It has objects and relationships to define how things link up, and it represents the truth outside of the product space or the company itself, as I said. And you might find that in any given company or organization, there's multiple domains and multiple domain models that end up linking up, but we're just going to focus on one at a time for simplicity here. And then that domain model evolves into a content model in which you decide the objects that matter to your organization and add their attributes. So this content model is for a ticket seller, not for anybody who has anything to do with live music. It would look different for a band. It would look different for a venue. So we would choose which of those objects are important for our content model. Now, there's many benefits of having a model, but I'm going to talk about 3 real quick. The first one is having structure for your content. It's the atoms of it, which can be mixed and matched over and over again. And if you follow the principles of atomic design, then the structured content fits neatly into that process of developing atoms, then molecules, putting them together as organisms and turning them into templates, and then ultimately web pages. This maps really well with that. You're also creating stakeholder alignment. You ask them what matters most to them, and they've given you information that maybe only they can without having them weigh in on web design. It's not that they're not going to say something about the website, but you can more easily steer them away from it when you're not looking at something on a screen. And you have content as design material, not boxes, but actual pieces, tiny little pieces that you can use to build an interface, or 5 or 10 or however many as you want over long periods of time. We can break the constant full redesign cycle where we tear everything down and rebuild it because it wasn't working. So that's the start. So now you've created that model and you can design the content, but not in an interface yet. Content design is probably a term you've heard. It's been used a lot lately, at least in the content strategy world. And what it really means is defining the user needs and creating content to meet them. So rather than starting with what shall I write, you start with what does a user need to know? And then you apply all the user experience principles to content itself. Make it useful, usable, findable, focused, targeted, distinctive, and connected. It's stuff you already know. You're just applying it to words, images, calculators, calendars, whatever the format needs to be to help a user complete their task. So you take all your content types in your model and determine what questions the user has about that thing. So taking from our ticket seller model, one of the content types was an act. So it's a could be a group of people, could be an individual. It's a conglomeration of things. So when someone comes to an acts page, they might have these questions. Who is this? What kind of music do they play? When are their concerts? How much do tickets cost? And how can I get tickets to the show? So you can see this is very progressive. If someone is interested, they'll keep going, and you've answered the question so people can self-eliminate at any time. And then you take those attributes from your model and answer those questions. So to answer who is the act, you might end up taking attributes from multiple content types. Perfectly fine, acceptable. No one says they have to stay together by themselves ever. In fact, they rarely do. So we would use the lineup content type, the lineup name from the lineup content type to ultimately to state what this lineup's name is, what this act's name is. And then maybe there's a performer in there, and then you want to know what years they're active. You want to know what kind of music do they play. You have a genre in there in the back end, and you can pull out that name. When are their concerts? Pull things from their tours and the performance and the venue to get the name, the tour name, the tour dates, the date of a specific performance, where that's located, and in what venue. How much do ticket cost? We grab from the ticket content type and get the cost attribute, and then the URL attribute so that you can buy tickets, because that's probably a different, completely separate system, but it can be connected. So creating these, I call the documents I use to set this all up content spec sheets, because we're specifying what content needs to appear. Some of you might recognize this because it's very similar to priority guides that was in a recent List Apart article by Helene Van Noys and Leonard Overkamp. Great, it was a lot of this. It talked about using guides like this with more information, of course. It evolves from here instead of wireframes. May or may not work for you, but even starting here is really, to me, the first step to make everything else successful as you go through the representations. So this might sound overly simplistic, and it is simple, but simple isn't easy and simple isn't minimal. You still have plenty of room to curate and apply hierarchical order using your model as the components. There's still room for your voice in the content for whatever distinct characteristics you want to use in your interface design. And the attributes, you can think of them as ingredients of a recipe. You can pick and choose, mix and match. You have the same set of spices and same cans of things in your pantry. You don't come out with the same thing every time. And it's just like this with structured content. Because then you have that and you can create sample content. And this is really the key to moving from a model and content design to the interface. So you need to develop sample content and attributes, because attributes are great for templates and designing the content, but they're not going to help so much as you actually create the representations. So you need to figure out all of the various permutations of the structure. Not every attribute is required, so you need to decide which instance of the content type has the most complete attributes, which has the least possible attributes, like only the required things, and anything that's complex in between. So in the previous slides, I showed you sample content that included information about U2 and their concert tour this year. Here's another example with the same attributes for the Violent Femmes. They just finished a tour, so there's no information about tours or performances. So, but you have to be prepared for that, right? When you represent it, because you're going to have thousands of instances of an act or a tour or a performance. And you need to be able to be prepared for whatever variety of content is going to go into those attributes. So to the question Matt asked, is content a known quantity that can be set then manipulated? It sure is. And I know you might be thinking, and your clients or stakeholders might be asking, but what will it look like? Here's the thing, it really doesn't matter. And not only does it not matter, it might never look like anything to the user. Voice is huge and exploding. If you ask Alexa when the Beyonce concert is, she doesn't show you something, she says something. So what it looks like just doesn't matter. We have to think differently. Stop beginning with something, with what something will look like or how it will be laid out, and start with what is the essential point, and get all of that set up so it can look like anything or nothing. This is not going to be easy. It will not happen for you or your team or your clients or your CEO overnight. It takes a lot of education and experiments and empathy to get to true user centricity, which is where I feel like we're going when we use this process. So rather than a chicken and egg dilemma where we're not sure what came first, this content model approach is more like a natural structure. So take the water molecule, H2O. There's always 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, but it can take the shape of a liquid, a solid in the form of ice, or gas like fog or vapor. And so now your content atoms can do the same thing. Take the shape of a heading on a web page, a title in a search engine results, and a response to someone asking a question in their kitchen, or beyond that, obviously. Those are just some examples. And here's the other day I asked friends for a recipe suggestion, and several people suggested black bean soup from moosewood. And these are just 3 of the ways those things can show up or be spoken. So now we've created the model, designed the content. Now we can create the representations for each interface that you need the content to appear in. You can figure out what it will look like, what order things will appear on the page, and what styles and formatting will be applied to them. And you have the same set of information to work from no matter what you're creating. Now, you might be wondering when I'm going to get to the sitemap part. Well, guess what? I'm not, because there's no sitemap anymore. There's no hierarchy to build to, because we have a model instead, which allows us to create all the resources to stand alone or to drop into a user's journey whenever it's appropriate for them. We don't have to try to figure that all out ahead of time. We will, of course, get to navigation. That is essential. But first, we're going to talk about the representations of the content itself without working with or worrying about site menus at this time. So bear with me, we will get there. So out of that model comes 2 natural types of representations, resources and indexes. A resource holds the content. An index gathers it into lists. In our case with live music, a performance is a resource, and the listing of upcoming performances is an index. And each of these you make decisions about which attributes to show. So we figure out, so all your content types are your resources, but you aren't going to necessarily display those in your interface. So for our ticket seller model, we might only want to show act, venue, performance, tour, and ticket. The other types, no, don't need to be published. They don't need to not exist, but they don't ever need to be displayed in our interface. Their purpose is served to hold things together in the back end. So for each of those content types, you'll publish, you'll create the user interface for the resource template. Doesn't matter how you get from point A to point B, you can start with designing in the browser, you can start with mockups, with sketching, whatever works for your team. The way we're doing it on a project I'm working on now with a design and development team is we've created all the spec sheets, and now the UI designer is creating screens for each resource in InVision. And then we review those before they get coded, and then they go to the coder while the CMS developer is setting it up, setting up each content type in the CMS. Doesn't matter, that works, that's working for us, that might not work for you, find your own flow. The important thing is to remember that you're creating templates for each thing. And so those things can accept new content. Authors can change content easily. They can remove content in part or in whole, and nothing's going to break because it's all data in the back. So here's two examples from a website, the Live Nation website here in the US. Both of these have tour name. They show up differently, right? We have tour name, we have an act name, we have a performance date, a venue name, and the venue, city, and state. And then of course there's obviously here a picture, there's a countdown clock to either being on sale or the concert with some other links, and there's other things on these pages, but they all come from the same resource, or at least I hope they do, and no one has to create each of these pages by themselves. Highly doubt that that's happening. But because everything's data in the back end, there's little risk of someone breaking the design on the front end, and they don't have to be technical to figure it all out. So let's talk a little bit about navigation now. URLs are a primary and super important aspect of navigation. You can define the URL right away because you're not worried about site structure, and it follows a basic format: your domain, content type, and resource name. This type of URL, in our case, gets a little bit complicated because there's a separate URL for each performance. So we have this big, giant, long Jay-Z and Beyonce OTR2 Arlington, Texas 09/11/2018, and that actually there's a lot more because it's a dynamic system, but you get the idea that there are many performances. You can predict the URL ahead of time. It's simple, reusable, and relatable to other things like it, not the location in the site structure. You might end up on this page from 100 different ways. So it doesn't matter where it is, it just matters that it is. So getting the content to the screen, you first want to arrange the attributes on the page with semantic HTML. I am not a coder. This is the extent of my HTML skills that I learned about 1999. Do not make fun of my coding. This is for demonstration purposes only. But if you want something better, this link here on the bottom, Rick Schenning's Smashing Magazine article called Content First, Design Last goes into a lot more detail about how you do this. It's called, yeah, he picks apart an actual page and puts it back together so that the HTML is what's getting the content to the screen, and then the CSS is added as a layer onto it to tell it what to look like. And in this way, you have inherently responsive and accessible code. And with the HTML all tidy, you can use the CSS to make it usable, because what's going to come out of this is not very usable and delightful at the same time. And you might ask yourself, as the folks at the UX Design Collective ask in their 2018 Trends article, when you remove all the styles, does your page still tell a cohesive, clear story? Something to think about, isn't it? I'm guessing a lot of times it's not. And my rudimentary knowledge of code, looking just on this website that we're looking at right now, I couldn't figure out anything. Had so much, I'm not going to call it junk, but it was very complex and it seemed overly complex to me. We need to get away from that. So back to those URLs. Now we can build the index templates. So for the URL, it's as simple as removing the resource name. We just get rid of the end, and now we're back to an index. So don't think of an index as some boring directory listing of titles that link to the resource detail. Index pages can be powerful and impactful. They can have photos and videos and headlines from the resources they bring together. They can be filtered by attributes or curated to tell a story. They can be personalized. Don't let the boring name fool you. All 4 of these things are examples of index pages for lots of different types of organizations. And now you have most of the content on your site, a bunch of templates of resources and index. But with all that research, user research and journey mapping you've done, you can see where there are gaps to fill with additional one-off pages. Maybe you call them singles or landing pages or web pages. The name doesn't matter. What does matter is that they are also made with structured content, perhaps with some of the content type data that's used in other places, maybe some global reusable pieces that can be mixed together with unique single purpose fields that only show up in one place. And to get these kind of one-off pages, you go through the same process as you would for the resource and index page. You go through that content design process. Who's the user? What do they need? What's the goal? What are the questions they have? How can we answer them? They don't have to be big chunks of WYSIWYG text. They can still be structured. So you're almost done. I said earlier that you can wait until the end to deal with navigation, and you can wait until the end to decide on your menus. But it's likely that everyone will feel better having them earlier. But the good news is you can also work on them in parallel to the content creation and the UI design work, because you have the model and you're creating this menu based on this series of resources and indexes. And that's a lot different, right, than creating to a set hierarchy defined by a sitemap. Because this is just all a separate layer in a stack of layers that we've created. A structured content stack, if you will, where we start at the bottom with our models and shape the structure and break the content down so that it can be connected. And then we can add the words and pictures for those content types that then can be represented as windows into that whole world. And lots of different windows, right? Just like if you look into your house, you see different things depending on which window you look in. Hopefully you have more than one window in your house. And then at that top are the pathways through that content. Again, those can be multiple. And indeed, you have global navigation and contextual navigation and hyperlinks and all different kinds of ways to navigate through the site. And of course, again, none of this is easy, but it sure as a heck is a lot easier to put the pixels together when you've already had the difficult conversations. And you don't have to discuss and decide things so much at this end of a project, because at some point it does become really what it looks like. But you're only arguing about that, not why and all the things that we've hammered out as we've created the content already. So I blew through that really fast. And of course, there are a lot of details that make this possible. There's each of those things, there's a how-to, there's other things that go into it. None of this excludes anything. I'm just focusing on a particular area and a particular way of doing things. But I hope that you now can see how it's possible to go content first, design last. How you can make connected content behind the scenes with perhaps simplicity up front and the complexity underneath. Your users do not want anything complex. How many times have you seen that complexity shown to you as a site visitor, as a user of a system that is so needless? That's part of the experience. But you can't do that if you don't start with content. And connected content really is inherently omni-channel ready. Like we said earlier, the content has to go everywhere. There is very little single-use content, but we can't keep making a whole new set of content every time there's a new device, every time there's a new technology, every time there's some sort of new disruption. We need to just be prepared. We need to be prepared to meet the demand, not keep buzzing underneath, recreating it every time. It's also inherently flexible. It can be reused in many interfaces. It can take lots of shape and form. It can be big. Any text or image can be big or small, or change fonts or change colors. Super, super flexible because it's data and completely separated from the design. It's extensible because it can connect within the thing that you're making, the system, but it can connect to other systems because you're working from the same model, and so everything has the same attributes. There's no bridging the gap between two systems with some Excel spreadsheet because the taxonomies don't match up, or you don't have the same fields, or the field names aren't the same. This encourages that so that you can extend your ecosystem easier and more deliberately. And it's also scalable. You can make thousands of more pieces of content of any given type, or remove 1,000 pieces without breaking anything, without really thinking. Of course, there's some thinking involved before you're doing that, but essentially it's there ready for you to do it. With this process, collaboration isn't just a buzzword. It's the true working together of people from many disciplines to create an experience that's useful, usable, and delightful. And everyone is happy. Your team, your stakeholders and clients, your users, and even the robots, who are really kind of taking over our world, aren't they? And they're a lot easier to make happy than any human, believe me. I'm sure you already know that. So if you want to learn more about this, you're in luck. There are some longer form ways to dig into the parts I skipped and get more details on the ones I did talk about. One way is to buy the book, Designing Connected Content, that Mike Atherton and I wrote last year, and it is available from any bookseller, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, online. Peach Pit Press is the publisher, so you can get it there as well. However you get them, I haven't actually looked in my local Barnes & Noble, so I'm not sure it's there, but that would be cool. Anyway, or as Jenna mentioned, there's an upcoming short course in this, so we'll go into more depth of how to create the model and how to set the intentions focused on the user with the content design in the short course that will start in about a month, 5 weeks. So we'll dig into that, and that's really, I feel like, economical way to dig in some more and get some good professional development. And now for one person who stays till the end, we have about 20, 25 minutes left. I've got a book to give away. We'll send it to you. We'll pick someone at the end who is still on, and we'll get your details afterwards. So with that, thanks for joining us. Following this, you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and at tonzenconsulting.com. We've got about 25 minutes to answer questions. I'll go switch over to the questions now and see what we have. Keep entering them if you have one, and we'll try to get to it. Back to technology.
Thanks so much, Carrie, for this. This is awesome. I'm wondering if you can see the questions that everybody is entering.
I can sort of see them.
If you cannot, I can read them for you.
All right, so a bunch of people had the screen. Okay, so here's a question from Linda. The distinction between content and copy can be blurred too easily. Design UX isn't possible without knowing what content the page will contain, but can't copy evolve as UX and design evolve? Yes, it certainly can, but not as much as you would think. So I mentioned we're in the middle of doing an interface representation based on this process. And we have changed copy slightly once we see it on the screen, but very little of that has changed. So it can evolve, and there is no, the good thing about the web is it's never done. Bad thing about the web is it's never done, but it certainly can evolve. And you're right, copy and content are not the same. Content is any substantive information represented through a medium. So it's copy, it's text and images and documents and video files and audio files and all kinds of other things. So thanks for that question. All right, here's another one from Sweta. Hopefully I said that right. In large organizations, there are different content types, and the content before design may not be relevant, as we need to standardize design and not allow for each unit or group to have different design based on their content types. Yes, you need standardized design, but that doesn't mean content can't come first. If you don't know what you're designing, then it can't be standardized. So the way I look at it is you still create pattern libraries. So this is how a blog post looks. It's always going to have a headline, a short description, and a thumbnail photo. You can standardize that pattern, that design pattern, based on the content that you have for the whole company. That's obviously one very simple example, but there's a lot of other things. So you still standardize around the content that's going to be represented. So you have to think through. It's not, like I said, it's not easy. You can put up, put a heading, an image, and a button somewhere, but if you don't know why that's being used, it makes it harder to keep it standardized, and people will just use it for whatever they want. So they definitely go hand in hand. I don't like that so many organizations separate editorial from visual design standards. They should be together, and they should all be governed together and have purpose, so that if something changes, if you're going to change how you publish news articles, then some of the design needs to change. But you shouldn't change the design until you know why you're changing it, because it's going to affect the content. I hope that made sense. So someone asked, is this a communication plan for your website? No, not at all. To me, a communication plan is marketing. How are you going to get people to your website is not the same as how to plan for what happens on the site. So if that's what you meant by communication plan, it's not like that. If you mean something different, enter another question and I'll come back to that. So here's a question from Lisa. A lot of designers start with user flows rather than content. How would you say defining flows fits in with defining the content model? I would define the content model first. And then what I do is do the content model first, and then map, when we create the flows or the journeys, we map the content to those flows. So that's how they fit together. I think, again, a lot of these things are separate, and they need to be mixed together a lot more. I ask a lot when people have questions, my clients have questions like, well, what should we do here? I don't know, what do the users need? And we have a lot of discussions like, okay, well, why is the user here? Where will they have come from? What is the most likely thing that they're going to want when they get to this screen? So we do a lot of back and forth on the users and their flow to make sure we're meeting them with the right content. Someone, Javon, asks, what tools do you use to manage structured content in the planning phase? Gather content is kind of expensive. Yes, Gather content is a great tool to manage structured content in planning before you have a CMS. I use Google Docs, not the greatest thing, but we're using the structured content. And so I've set up templates and things that help us with that. It's certainly not ideal. There's also Andy Fitzgerald has a content prototyping article on Smashing Magazine from a couple of years ago. He's put together a way to do that, so I encourage you to check that out. I'll send some links to some of these things after that I didn't include in the slides, which also will be available in SlideShare in the next couple of days. So yeah, we're kind of behind the tools on this. I'm constantly looking for new tools. So if anybody has great tools that they use, I'd love to hear about it. Janet asked if we had workshops that I offer for teams, and the answer is yes. Visit my website, tonzinconsulting.com, and you can see the workshops that I have. We can also do custom workshops, but I do this to help teams learn how to incorporate this into their process. All right. Another question from Lisa. In the content model example shown, you have the individual objects more or less connected into a central content. Can there be a relationship between two at the outer points, like ticket and tour, or is that redundant? The visual, it kind of looks like that, Lisa, because I don't want to have those. It's really hard to follow the lines when they go around the outside. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen sometimes. So there's no reason it looks like the way it does. It's just how I've set it up visually. So there can be a relationship between any two things, and often as you're going through the process of creating a model, you'll add and remove relationships more than once because they haven't been made. But you want to have just as many as you need, and however you can make that work. I work on a team that is very dedicated to the design first model. How would you suggest getting them to see the glory of the model that you've just espoused? I've been trying, but without much success. You're not alone. Uh, there's probably a lot of people listening now, and there's certainly a lot of people who aren't listening that have that problem. I recently worked with a new team who was very much design first, which was frustrating for me since I've been doing it this way for so long. But one of the ways I did it was to raise those user questions. Like, okay, you just put a box there or an image because you think that's how it should look, but what's going there? Do you have that content? And just in a matter of 30 minutes, as we were trying to wireframe a homepage without a model or without knowing what content was on the site, there was a lot of questions that came up. Well, we could put blog posts there. Oh, great idea. Wait, are they going to have blog posts? So just start asking questions and slowly, start with the things that you can have control over. But to me, the questions about what is actually going to be there, do you have it? Who's going to be in charge of it if you think you're going to have it? Those kinds of things start helping you shift over and just try lots of different tactics till you hit on one that works. So good luck to you and all the others who are in that situation. Jane asks, for an existing website, how do you get from a sitemap to a model, or do you have to totally reformulate the data? I'm not sure if this happened before or after I said there was no sitemap. So that's essentially it. There's no sitemap. So you're not getting from a sitemap to a model. If you are trying to create a model from an existing sitemap, it's a start, it's an input to help you do that. I also find looking at the back end of the current CMS helpful as a starting point. So it's more part of an inventory and part of the process early on to identify the content types. But you're never going to go back to it once you start modeling, I hope. At least I haven't. All right, Julie asks, what is the best way to integrate gathering the information needed to define the domain and content models with other forms of UX, such as user interviews? So yeah, especially the domain model is kind of an extension of user experience. And the best way, so there's desk research, so just looking up, like once you determine the domain, research the subject. So you can start seeing patterns. And then when you're doing user interviews, you want to do subject matter expert interviews as well as user interviews. And you just ask questions a little bit differently, getting them to talk more about that subject area rather than just the product or how they would use it. So it's really an extension to that. In the book, there's a sample interview questions and that you can use to help guide that. Deborah asks, what are your preferred ways of representing content models and how are they best communicated? I'm going to start with how they're best communicated. They're best communicated by involving people in creating them. They can be difficult to explain to people who haven't seen them before. But when I have done it, when we haven't had everyone involved in the creation of the model, I talk to people in groups. So we just really talk about a few content types at a time and talk them through that. I also have a list of points that I make when we're doing that to remind them what they're looking at and things like that. Representing these are difficult. When I do it virtually, I often use Real-Time Board, which is one of the online collaboration tools similar to Mural. I've done them in PowerPoint. I haven't tried Airtable, but I've heard that a lot of people like that. And so, but it's really hard. The visual side of it, where I sometimes have just the content types and then have a spreadsheet with all the attributes, because there's so much more that come up that can't be on a single screen, and it becomes hard. So still a work in progress, and people are starting to crack the nut on the tools for representing these things.
Carrie,
Yeah.
we have time just for one more question because
Okay.
it's already 1 p.m.
Okay. All right, let me see here. There's just a few more questions. Okay, here's a fairly quick question. How do you do development while you're also doing UX? This question refers to the model you propose at the parallel development approach. So I don't know what doing UX means. To me, it means you're creating an experience. So it's built in all the way. So I don't have a separate UX step or even UX design, which to me means wireframes. So it's incorporating it all along. I incorporate that in my content creation by asking what the user, who the user is, what they want, what are their questions, and then doing that. So, but the thing is, in that parallel process, you have to talk to each other. You can't have the content person go off on their own and the designer go off on their own and the developer go off on their own. They have the same planning sheet, but things are going to come up and they're going to have questions, so they have to talk to each other. That's where that real collaboration comes in. There's no handoffs and there's no going into your own silo. Again, not easy, but it can be done. So thank you all. And for those of you still here, I'm just going to close my eyes and scroll through the list of attendees and pick a name. I think that's probably about the fairest way I can do it with what we've been given. All right, let me pop this out and get over here so I can see a bigger chunk of this, maybe. Yes. All right. Janet Osorio, you're the winner. Thank you for your question, and I think I'll follow up with you. I'll get your email from UXPA and follow up with you to get your address so I can send you a book. Yeah, so thank you all again for coming. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'd love to see more about how you make this happen. So good luck, and have fun trying to get this incorporated into your team. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carrie. We are looking forward to your course in a month or so. Thanks, everybody.